families having children is important for a lot of reasons. I'll start with politically. Family, I'm just going right to the cheapest end of it. So if you're a Republican, you care, and you're a conservative or a libertarian, and you don't like socialism, you need to vote to support families and support pro-family economics, because it's the families who have children who are producing the next generation of constitutional libertarian type conservatives, right? We've done a lot of studies on this, actually, and it's fascinating. There is a direct correlation between family formation and political outcomes. What we found is that the married families with children vote like conservative libertarians. They want unlimited government. They want social values to be upheld in the public square. They don't like high taxes on businesses. But on the other end of the spectrum, these never married and cohabitating households, those are our nightmare. Those are the households that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are raised in, and they produce socialists. Because why? It's very simple. These families that when they're never married or cohabitating, these kids start off life on government assistance, right? So they start off with on the parents on food stamps or the parents on unemployment or disability. It's a nightmare. And they end up thinking government is my parent. We need to prioritize family formation to get more conservatives voting in politics and to continue this American experiment. Without it, we'll die. Economically speaking, it's a no-brainer. You need more people. Otherwise, you're going to have more old people than young people, and less young people means less people paying taxes. It's just basically that simple.
Like the Japan story right now.
It's exactly the Japan story. And you do not want to go down that road. I mean, Japan is socially and culturally really screwed up when it comes to sex and procreation. I mean, the stories that come out of Japan about how parents have to hire strippers basically to get their young men interested in sex because they're so porn addicted. They don't even connect the sexual act to a human being. That's insane. And America's on the verge of going down that route. I know it sounds crazy right now, but with virtual reality porn, all these sex toys, like, it's not crazy to think that in a few years, with our declining marriage rates, our declining birth rates, we're below replacement levels now when it comes to birth rates. So we're not even replacing enough Americans to keep the population the same. It's not crazy to think that we will have a Japan crisis here when it comes to population. So, but beyond that, people that are saying that this is socialism are just ridiculous. I mean, just absolutely. If you just compare how corporations are treated with their taxes versus how families are treated, corporations, number one, pay taxes on their net income, which means they get to cut out the costs of their rent, their employment, their benefits that they pay their employees, and their cost of doing business before they pay the taxes on that. So when I'm a family, though, I'm basically a small business in a way, right? Like I'm the CEO actually my wife is the CEO. My wife's the CEO, and she's in charge, and we have these little employees that we have to pay to train, through their education. We have to feed them, clothe them, and shelter them. I don't get to write any of that off of my taxes at the end of the year. But a corporation doing the same thing for its employees gets to do all of that. So if you want to talk about socialism is taxing people more than businesses, right? Like it really says a lot about the priorities of the American government and the IRS when it comes to how we tax the American people. And we primarily rely on taxing American families instead of corporations. And it really should be 50-50. I mean, if you do the breakdown, and it's something like 69% of all federal taxes are paid by families, and only 31% are paid by businesses through excise taxes, the corporate tax rate, and payroll taxes. It's crazy. It should be 50-50. So if you want to talk about socialism, let's talk about that and how corporations really aren't taxed their fair share.
Why do children really have a right to their mother and father, which is actually going to be a major stumbling block for your audience, because very academic and in-tune conservatives bristle at the term children's rights. That is because the left has so adulterated and co-opted it to advance things that are not just not children's rights, but ideologies that very often subvert children's actual rights. So the first chapter is making the case for why children do indeed have a right to their mother and father. But the second chapter is about why biology matters in the parent-child relationship. And, biology is irrelevant. Love makes a family has been the mantra that has normalized all manner of modern families. And when I say modern family, that it just means modern family is code for child loss. A modern family requires that a child lose some or all of a relationship with their mother or father to be in that family. Okay. So we have accepted this narrative that biology is irrelevant. But when you look at child rights, well-being, and identity, what you see is biology is hyper relevant for all of those different areas. So why does biology matter? 3 reasons. Number 1, biology matters to children because only the 2 people responsible for their existence grant something to children that they crave, and that is their biological identity. It is very hard to answer the question, who am I? If you cannot answer the question, whose am I? And so this is actually, and how do we know that this is true? By looking at the populations that have been raised apart from their biological identity. So you look at adoption best practice in this country, and I was the assistant director at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world before I had kids. So I was very familiar with international and domestic standards for adoption. And what we see, especially in domestic adoption, is this radical shift away from closed adoption, which was not just practiced, but recommended in the 50s and 60s and 70s, to now 95% of adoptions in the United States are open.
What's the difference between those? Like, what is a closed versus an open adoption?
Closed is you don't have any identifying information or any contact with the child's first family.
Okay.
Open adoption, there's degrees of openness, but open adoption means you have some knowledge or some contact or some ongoing relationship with somebody in the first family. Maybe it's just the grandparents, but sometimes it's the birth mother herself. And what they've found is social workers have found that children benefit from as many connections as possible from their first family, even if they can't be raised by them. And we overhauled adoption best practice once we recognized that. So even if there's a situation where it's the birth parents are unable or unwilling or should not parent the child, we've still recognized that the child has a right to and benefits from knowledge at minimum of who their parents are. Because kids have these questions. Do they look like me? Do they know that I exist? Why did they give me up? Would they love me if they met me? Who is my mother? You know, if they don't know, who is she? And we see this very clearly now with the population, not that was separated from their parents at birth, but separated from their parents at conception. Kids created through sperm and egg donation. They have deep identity issues. And the only study that we have that compares outcomes between kids created through sperm donation and adoption showed that the sperm donor kids who had at least one biological parent have more identity issues than the adoptees.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we can talk about why that is. But the reality is that even if you're raised by a biological parent, there is something about being intentionally separated from one of your genetic parents that plunges you into an identity crisis. Likely because one reason why is because those kids that we're surveying now had more anonymous donation, not open ID donors. And the other aspect, and this is really the distinction, I think, they were intentionally cut off from one of their parents versus the adoptees who the people raising the adopted kids did not choose for them to be abandoned. Did not choose for them to be orphaned. People raising children created through sperm, egg donation, and surrogacy chose for their child to be alienated from one or both parents. And that has leveled and increased psychological burden on kids.
Yeah.
So biology matters because those 2 adults give children their biological identity. And you could argue, and others have argued better than me, that one of the reasons why we have so many kids seeking sexual and gender identities is because we have robbed them of the places where they have historically answered the question, who am I? And that is in kinship bonds, ethnic connections, and familial bonds.
The ICD-10 code, diagnosis code for marijuana addiction is cannabis use disorder. It's got a whole code group that you'll be diagnosed with if you go to the doctor and you have it. So it's not even a discussion in the scientific community. It's not even a debate. The only place where it is a debate is with people with profit incentive, industry representatives who say it's no big deal. And we've seen this all before. Purdue Pharma, opioids. There was one little paragraph of text in the New England Journal of Medicine in early 2000 or late 90s that said people using OxyContin, only just under 2% of them find it to be habit forming with opioids, with OxyContin. And most of us would look at that and say that's insane now. But for 2 decades, Purdue Pharma and all the opioid guys made a killing off of that one paragraph of erroneous text in one research study that was used to say, oh, it's not addictive. And we're seeing the exact same thing play out with marijuana, where you have some people who didn't get addicted to it. Yeah, like there are people who didn't get addicted to OxyContin. There are people who don't get addicted to cigarettes. We're not talking about a drug that's universally addictive. We're talking about percentages here. And so, low grade marijuana was 10% addiction rate. Now we're seeing 1 in 3, about a 30% addiction rate with marijuana now. And that is established science. You can look up National Institute of Drug Abuse, National Institutes of Health. The research is really rock solid on that. So that's one key thing that has changed. The other thing in the research that we're seeing that is really, in my opinion, maybe even more concerning, is the link between high grade marijuana and mental illness. So the Lancet Journal of Psychiatry is probably one of the most sterling institutions out there that does research on this subject. And they've released several massive population level studies just in the last 5 years that have looked across thousands of people using marijuana. And what they found is regular users of today's high potency marijuana 5 times more likely to develop schizophrenia or psychosis, which for those of you who've read Alex Berenson's book, you should definitely read it. It's called Tell Your Children. It's about marijuana. He looks at the link between marijuana use and the psychosis induced by that and violence. Which is a really interesting link that is worth reading more about. But you see this linkage now with schizophrenia, psychosis. Now we're seeing things in depression and suicidal ideation that we never saw before, all because of the changes we've seen in this substance. And I will tell you, in Colorado, the number one drug that comes up in our youth suicide toxicology by far is THC. It's marijuana. So I think people, again, will listen to this and say, is this reefer madness? Like, is it, this is crazy. It's just marijuana. And what I tell them is, we know in Colorado that marijuana is not the substance it used to be. We're not talking about these low-grade joints anymore. We're talking about concentrates. We're talking about a brand new, literally chemical-grade product now that's been modified. And so we have to kind of eliminate our preconceived notions about what this drug used to be and really understand what it is now, because of a commercial industry that's totally altered it. And one of the biggest arguments I hear is legalize, regulate, so you can card people. And so intuitively, people think, oh, if it's legal and regulated and they're carding people at the door, like surely kids aren't going to get into it then. And then I kind of look around the room and I say, well, I went to public high school. How did that work for alcohol and tobacco exactly? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know where people kind of have forgotten about like the fact that those things flow like water through youth's hands in this country. So legalizing, regulating does not prevent our kids from getting into it. And so, yeah, youth are using it. If you look at, so I have a slide deck I do on this, but if you look at a graph of yearly use and monthly use for youth in legal states versus non-legal states, it's not even in the same conversation. I mean, it's much higher in legal states than in non-legal states. So youth are using it more. Addiction rates are higher. So there was a study that came out recently that said after legalization, every single state that legalized marijuana saw a 25% increase in cannabis use disorder for youth. So youth are getting more addicted to this substance in legal states. We know the message that it sends because the products that they're using are clearly targeting kids. So with tobacco, a lot of us are probably too young to like know have experienced it, personally, but they were using, candy cigarettes. They had Joe Camel. They had mascots. They were using all sorts of child-friendly packaging and colors and products and all that stuff. We're seeing that now a little bit with Juul and some of the other vaping companies. Same thing is happening with the marijuana industry, where they've got, Sesame Street characters. Like a pot shop in Denver was literally using Cookie Monster to advertise its pot cookies. Then they've got Girl Scouts flavors. I could go on and on and on. Gummy bears, all these things. And people say, well, we'll just regulate that. Like, we'll write laws that say that's wrong, right? And it's like, every single state that's legalized marijuana says you can't target kids. You can't have child-friendly packaging. So explain to me how Cookie Monster ends up getting through and getting approved by regulators. Well, it's because these industries are able to overpower the regulatory state. And you can't possibly fund these regulatory agencies, nor maybe should we. That's another conversation. You can't possibly fund them enough to stop a multi-billion-dollar industry from doing whatever it is they want to do. Once you develop an addiction, it is a disease as we understand it. So you make a choice, you make a series of bad choices in terms of getting into, using a certain substance. Then you've developed an addiction. Now what you've got is a disease that needs to be treated. And that disease, and this is what concerns me the most about it, Saurabh, is that disease is antithetical to your natural functioning as a human being. It causes you to do things that destroy yourself It causes you to do things that destroy your family. It causes you to do things that destroy society, frankly, that you don't want to do if you were in a rational frame of mind. But addiction can drive you to do horrible things in order to sustain that addiction. And that's why we understand it as a disease, because it drives you to do very awful things. And so from my perspective, I look at the family as a really key base unit of society. And I've seen addiction time and time again destroying families in this country, because you'll literally end up in a situation where someone's addicted. They will steal from their relatives. They'll steal from their parents. They'll, pawn off, sell their car, whatever. They'll do things to destroy and hurt their family in order to sustain their addiction that they would not do if they were living in that addiction. And so that's where, to me, the conversation around drugs is so vitally important, because if we legalize and sustain these things, there will be people driving a profit off of the continued addiction of folks. And that is, in my opinion, going to denigrate our institutions and our pillars of society, which in my opinion begins with the family.
Ever since the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, there's been a real hesitance to do war memorials or even almost any memorials that are heroic. We've seen so many victim memorials. I mean, when was the last time you went to a contemporary art museum and saw patriotic artwork?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really hard to think of it. And to give a case in point of just how bad this can be, if you go to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where they have the United Flight 93 Memorial, commemorating the plane that went down on September 11, as you know, the passengers stormed the cockpit, and yes, the plane crashed, but they saved a core building of government. Yeah. It's like what they did is up there with Paul Revere's ride and its significance in American history. Ordinary Americans fighting terrorists and essentially winning. There is nothing in the memorial in Pennsylvania commemorating the heroism of the passengers on that flight. You could imagine an inscription saying, "Let's roll." I mean, you could even imagine some men standing behind what is that cart called? A beverage cart. I mean, you could do it, right? A really good sculptor could do it. And I went to a public talk by the designers of that memorial, and I asked him, how come none of that is in there? And he told me, well, we didn't want to do anything controversial. So that's an outlook that I think is shared by a lot of the art establishment. By contrast, the competition for the World War I Memorial, the final winning design has this incredible heroic sculpture by Sabin Howard, who has said about his design, which recently just opened in Washington, "There are no victims here. Everyone's a hero." Now, that's not to say that there isn't tragedy and suffering in the design, but at the same time, you see soldiers, bravely marching as comrades in arms, entering the crucible of battle, holding rifles with bayonets, screaming. It's really powerful. And then, then you see the wreckage of the battlefield, which includes a twisted cross or a broken cross, a wounded or dead soldier being held by a nurse, and you see a shell-shocked soldier. But what do you see at the end of the memorial is a victory parade with the American flag. And then at the final image, you see a soldier returning home, handing his helmet to his daughter, who is all grown up. Because at the very beginning of the memorial, which should be read from left to right, it's cinematic. It's telling a story of a single soldier. In fact, it's called a soldier's journey. At the beginning, he's leaving home with his daughter young, and at the end, she's all grown up. And he's essentially handing her World War II. But the memorial demonstrates America on the rise. We are now a world power. And it's hard to imagine, nothing like this has been built in America for a very long time. And the sculptor has said he hopes that this is the beginning of a new American cultural renaissance.